I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 131, Gazing at the Stars. The Storm God's aerial motherships with unparalleled mobility and transport capabilities had enabled the Swarm to take bold strides forward. However, the pace of expansion had far exceeded the Swarm's troop reserves, making it impossible to simultaneously establish bases across the continent. Fortunately, the Swarm's agility meant that no base required a standing force of millions as before. Each location needed only a juvenile brood queen, a fungal carpet seed, and a small contingent of auxiliary units. Given time, a swarm base would gradually take shape. Even in the face of insurmountable threats, as long as the base could hold out briefly, the air bases constructed with higher priority could quickly deploy reinforcements to the troubled area. At worst, retaliation was always an option. Gradually, the bases began to develop and expand, radiating their influence outward. One apex predator after another, such as the T-Rex, was located, surrounded, and hunted down. These massive creatures, with their voracious appetites, were no longer needed in the swarm's territory. Initially, they had been left alone to maintain ecological balance, but that was no longer necessary. As time passed, the swarm, now unrivaled on land, began to extend its reach into the ocean. Luo Wen already had genetic templates for various marine organisms, such as crabs, prawns, and mantis shrimp. During the conquest of the land, he had also acquired numerous aquatic genes, including those of carnivorous fish and crocodiles. Although many were freshwater species, Luo Wen's mastery of genetic modification allowed him to adapt them to survive and thrive in saltwater environments. With its exceptional logistics and resource-gathering capabilities, combined with a diverse array of specialized units, the swarm gradually occupied the coastal shallows around the continent. Even the sunless deep ocean was not beyond the swarm's reach. Exploration teams were dispatched to these depths, where vision was less effective but echolocation adapted from bat abilities proved invaluable. This unique adaptation shone underwater, enabling the swarm to extend its territory further into the deep sea. Although the swarm's numbers were significantly smaller than before Luo Wen's long slumber, its occupied territory had expanded several-fold. With everything running smoothly, Luo Wen found himself growing increasingly idle and bored. In the following days, Luo Wen wandered aimlessly across the swarm's vast domain. Sometimes, he would climb to the peaks of towering mountains to watch the sunrise. Other times, he would sit on a sandy beach, gazing at the moonlight reflecting on the waves. His wanderings, however, were not without purpose. Despite the swarm's advanced transportation system and the fact that Luo Wen had already collected most of the planet's genetic material, certain organisms and plants were difficult to preserve. Now that circumstances allowed, Luo Wen preferred to sample them fresh. Years passed in the blink of an eye. Luo Wen had experienced nearly everything this planet had to offer. Apart from the unexplored depths of the ocean, he had traversed most of the planet's surface. Yet, with time, a growing sense of loneliness gnawed at him. The vastness of the planet felt like a gilded cage nonetheless. Lying on a fine, soft beach, the salty sea breeze brushing his face, Luo Wen gazed up at the starlit sky. Above him, 2 moons glowed amid countless sparkling stars. This planet, untouched by pollution, offered an astonishingly clear view of the night sky. Ever since the first time he had admired the celestial panorama by the sea, stargazing had become one of Luo Wen's favorite pastimes. Looking at the dazzling stars, he often wondered, where was this place? Was one of those distant lights Earth? Were there aliens out there? If he could return to Earth, would he now be considered an alien himself? Such thoughts often brought a lump to his throat. Soon, his thoughts shifted. Now that he had essentially mastered this planet, with an unknown lifespan ahead, how should he spend the endless years? Could he truly live out his days as the planetary lord? If so, how would he endure the boundless stretches of time? He recalled an old adage from his previous life, our journey lies among the stars and the seas. Perhaps he could set his sights beyond this world. But was that even possible? Luo Wen, though lacking astronomical knowledge, knew enough to understand how hostile outer space was to life. The vacuum, extreme cold, and relentless radiation were more than enough to obliterate any living being. Moreover, even contemplating such ambitions was premature. He had no idea how to reach outer space. The storm gods had a maximum flight altitude of less than 20,000 meters. Using them to breach the atmosphere was nothing short of a fantasy. As for relying on his evolutionary talent to develop such capabilities, the time required was incalculable. His talent wasn't omnipotent, it merely accelerated evolution. The specialized abilities of a species usually required tens of thousands, even millions of years to evolve. Even if Luo Wen shortened this time span by 1,000 or 10,000 times, the effort required would still be daunting. This was why Luo Wen often practiced what he called the doctrine of borrowing. Many biological abilities were the result of eons of refinement proven and perfected. If ready-made solutions were available, why reinvent the wheel? For example, species with low offensive capabilities often evolved defensive traits. Hardened carapaces were the most common, but regenerative abilities and toxins were also defensive adaptations. Predatory species, on the other hand, always had sharp fangs and claws. The Epheish's strength lay in its ability to absorb such genes, combine them, and enhance both offense and defense, then improve further from that baseline. However, evolving spacefaring capabilities from scratch? Luo Wen had never heard of a creature achieving such a feat. Attempting it himself was not only time-consuming but might even prove impossible. Nevertheless, he had noticed during some of his genetic experiments that understanding specific theories could make it easier to acquire or derive certain abilities. For instance, he had extensively used toxin sacs in the past and was familiar with their mechanics. This familiarity allowed him to refine and miniaturize the sacs, integrating them into the legs of the spider combat bugs with ease. Perhaps if he had learned rocket science in his previous life, he might now be able to accelerate the genetic evolution needed for space exploration. In his former life, he had indeed built rockets and even spacecraft, but only in video games. Gathering resources, clicking build, and waiting for a progress bar to fill was his entire process. The finished product would then appear magically before him. He knew nothing of the underlying principles. Reality wasn't a game, and such shortcuts were impossible. Here, there was no Baidu, no libraries, and no books or research materials. Even if Luo Wen wanted to become self-taught, he had no means to do so. And expecting him to independently discover and develop those theoretical frameworks? That was laughably optimistic. Those theories represented the collective efforts of entire civilizations, billions of people, and centuries of work. Chapter 132, A New Idea Emerges, 1. Luo Wen fell into deep contemplation. On this beach, he remained still for a full 3 days, neither eating nor drinking. Thanks to the reserves stored in his tail lard organ, not only could he endure 3 days, but he could go as long as 3 months without needing sustenance. As for the dampness of the seaside or issues like arthritis, Luo Wen could replace his appendages at any time. Would something as trivial as arthritis even matter to him? During these 3 days, he focused on a single question. This planet, while lacking apples, had similar fruits. His question revolved around what thoughts came to mind when these fruits fell from the tree to the ground. In the end, his musings led to a jumble of disorganized thoughts. While he had heard of universal gravitation, he couldn't form any coherent theories. The truth was that developing rockets on his own was less realistic than biding his time, relying on luck, and evolving the necessary traits through his innate abilities. Examining his genetic library, he found that advancing into outer space presented specific challenges. Wings, effective only within the atmosphere, were practically useless in outer space, where the absence of air reduced their functionality to almost nothing. Perhaps wings would ultimately be less effective than a high-pressure jet propulsion system. Of course, the most promising solution was the anti-gravity system of Beetle Elytra. However, this system currently served only to reduce weight. Still, further development in this area might yield meaningful progress. But venturing into outer space wasn't as simple as just flying out. How would he harvest energy in outer space? How would he breathe? How would he survive in ultra-low temperatures? How would he navigate the cosmos? Would he truly rely on jet propulsion? He had no desire to become a piece of floating space debris. There were too many problems to consider. Even a single unresolved issue could pose a threat to his survival. After several more days, Luo Wen had a sudden epiphany: perhaps he could create some helpers. As the saying goes, 3 humble tailors can outwit Zhuge Liang. If he created more blades, perhaps they could pool their ideas. Months later, he realized he had overestimated the potential of the blades. While they lacked any sense of creativity, his tinkering did enhance their learning and adaptability. The blades became more akin to intelligent apes. The more they experienced and learned, the smarter they became. These traits could also be passed down through the swarm network. Over time, their intelligence would continue to grow. However, intelligence was not the same as wisdom, and their lack of creativity remained their greatest flaw. They could serve as excellent commanders but were incapable of becoming scientists. Once again, his train of thought hit a dead end. After some time, Luo Wen suddenly realized that if the swarm was unsuitable, he could develop other species. Other species might not have the same limitations. With this new idea in mind, Luo Wen immediately set to work, searching for groups suitable for cultivation. He sought species with traits such as adaptability, intelligence, and strong reproductive abilities. After rigorous screening, 2 species emerged as the top candidates. These 2 species were ones Luo Wen was already very familiar with. They were old acquaintances of the swarm from the earliest days, tail-lard rats and small dinosaurs. The tail-lard rats reproduced rapidly, birthing 5–10 offspring per litter. The pups could begin foraging for food within just a few days. Being omnivorous, they ate almost anything and occupied the very bottom of the food chain. While creatures like ants were weaker, their low meat content made them less appealing prey. In contrast, the tail-lard rats, with their larger size and poor combat ability, were a favorite target for predators. However, the tail-lard rats' unique energy storage organs made them exceptionally resilient. When pursued, they could sometimes hide motionless for over 10 days, outlasting their predators. They were also relatively intelligent compared to other species. The small dinosaurs, despite being predators, were also prey due to their size. They occupied a slightly higher position in the food chain than the tail-lard rats. These creatures could lay 7 or 8 eggs at a time. While the incubation period for these eggs was longer, their hatchlings could forage for food shortly after hatching. As for their intelligence, their cooperative hunting tactics and basic strategies demonstrated significant cleverness. With 2 experimental species chosen, Luo Wen began cultivation efforts. He first extracted their genetic templates, enlarging their brain capacity. Having watched videos on human evolution, Luo Wen knew that bigger brains were the key to progress. He then implemented some unconventional methods. Capturing wild tail-lard rats and small dinosaurs, Luo Wen introduced them to the experimental specimens for interbreeding. Although swarm-produced tail-lard rats and small dinosaurs lacked intelligence, their offspring with wild counterparts might inherit the enhanced brain capacity. This approach aimed to accelerate their cognitive evolution and foster the emergence of smarter offspring. However, things didn't progress smoothly. Despite prolonged captivity together, no offspring were produced. This left Luo Wen perplexed. As a non-specialist, he lacked expertise in these matters. Could it be that swarm-produced tail-lard rats and small dinosaurs had undergone species changes? Aside from brain enhancements, Luo Wen hadn't altered any other parts of their genetic templates. For other enhanced swarm creatures, sterility was common, but these specimens were not supposed to have that issue. Unwilling to give up, Luo Wen persisted. With nothing else pressing, this research became a way to pass the time. Time passed, and his experimental field expanded several-fold. It was divided into numerous compartments, each housing different combinations of specimens. The skies above were patrolled by Type I flying bugs, while modified spider combat bugs monitored the perimeter. Even underground, worker ants and fungal carpets maintained vigilance. With half of the experimental specimens being swarm-produced, the laboratory operated with perfect order, with no incidents of escape. After rounds of testing, several months later, a breakthrough finally came. A wild tail-lard rat became pregnant. A month later, it gave birth to a litter of 5. Armed with this newfound knowledge, Luo Wen conducted more experiments based on this set of data. Once again, he achieved successful reproduction, confirming the problem's source. It turned out Luo Wen had been too hasty, attempting to enlarge the tail-lard rat's brains too significantly in one step. This had caused reproductive isolation from their wild counterparts, preventing offspring. By scaling up his experiments, dividing the specimens into multiple groups with varying brain capacity enhancements, Luo Wen finally made progress. Using these successful cases, Luo Wen refined the process, identifying the maximum amount of brain capacity enhancement that would avoid triggering reproductive isolation. With this insight, the pace of experimentation accelerated. Chapter 133, A New Idea Emerges, 2. Not long after, the newly adjusted small dinosaurs successfully produced offspring as well. The successive successes of both experimental species greatly boosted Luo Wen's confidence. With the nutritional support of the fungal carpet, the newborns grew rapidly. Their brain capacity, inherited from their modified parents, had slightly expanded. They were then paired with the enhanced experimental specimens for further breeding. Generation after generation, through continuous reproduction, the brains of the new tail-lard rats and small dinosaurs grew progressively larger and more intelligent. After some training, they could already understand some of Luo Wen's instructions. During this period, Luo Wen discovered an additional feature of the swarm network. Its essence seemed to be a form of awakened psychic power that had undergone mutations due to a sacrificial infusion of special energy. However, it still retained some general abilities associated with psychic power. For instance, Luo Wen could forcibly link to certain individuals with lower psychic strength than his own, transmitting information directly via telepathy. In one of his experimental fields, 2 tail-lard rats crouched in front of Luo Wen. One was bred naturally, while the other was produced by a brood queen. Under the demonstration of the swarm-bred tail-lard rat, the naturally bred one quickly learned several commands, such as sitting, shaking hands, and eating. But such accomplishments seemed trivial. On Earth, domestic animals like pet dogs could easily learn these tricks with some basic training. Some even exhibited abilities like counting, yet none had ever developed scientific theories. Luo Wen began seriously recalling human evolutionary history. After brain expansion, the next milestone was mastering the use of tools, wasn't it? Thus, for a time, the experimental fields were filled with the sight of tail-lard rats and small dinosaurs wandering around with small wooden sticks, banging on things. In this regard, the tail-lard rats had a natural advantage. Their forelimbs were closer to human hands, with 4 highly flexible fingers. With minimal training, they quickly learned to use various tools. The small dinosaurs, on the other hand, had only 3 clawed fingers with stiff joints. While they could use tools, their precision in delicate operations lagged far behind the tail-lard rats. Still, Luo Wen adhered to the philosophy that the more options, the better. The thought of cultivating a race of little dino people was undeniably intriguing. While training the experimental subjects, Luo Wen continued the work of incrementally expanding their brain capacities. Interestingly, he discovered that because half of the experimental subjects' direct ancestors were swarm creations, the offspring retained trace amounts of swarm traits. Though they lacked swarm node identities, they harbored a natural affinity toward Luo Wen. This made subsequent training significantly easier. Luo Wen even set up a hunting ground where the subjects could wield rudimentary weapons to hunt. In these scenarios, the tail-lard rats performed better. Perhaps due to their naturally non-combative physiology, they displayed a stronger reliance on tools. The small dinosaurs, however, despite generations of breeding, still retained their predatory instincts. When hunting, especially against weaker prey, they preferred to rely on their sharp teeth and claws. However, Luo Wen soon encountered another challenge. He wanted to teach the experimental subjects language and writing. The birth of civilization required continuity, and their experiences and culture needed a means of preservation. Luo Wen had no experience teaching such concepts to non-human creatures. Writing was less problematic, as it was inherently flexible and could be explained in various ways. Language, however, posed a greater challenge. The anatomical differences between the 2 species resulted in significant variations in their speech capabilities. Furthermore, Luo Wen had no memory of the human vocal structure and thus couldn't modify them to have better voices. He couldn't possibly invent 2 entirely new languages tailored to their vocal characteristics, could he? Knowing his limitations, Luo Wen dismissed the idea. It simply wasn't a task he was equipped to handle. Feeling mentally drained, Luo Wen decided to take a trip to unwind. Recently, he had devoted all his energy to experiments and hadn't taken a break in ages. He still had plenty of time, and no one was pressuring him to meet deadlines. There was no need to push himself so hard. He returned to the familiar seaside, located in the northern hemisphere. The climate was pleasant, the scenery beautiful, and during the day, many seabirds soared nearby. Sprawled on the fine, pale yellow sand, Luo Wen basked in the sunlight. After enjoying a hearty meal at a nearby base, he came here to wait for nightfall and stargazing. Watching the brilliant Milky Way had become one of his few remaining pastimes. But why were stars appearing in broad daylight? A star grew in his field of vision, becoming larger and larger until it turned into a massive fireball. That's a meteor, Luo Wen jolted as he realized what he was seeing. He recalled a time when he had woken up in the middle of the night to watch a meteor shower, only to wait for hours in vain. Later, he checked the news online and learned that his location had been at the wrong angle to see it. Meteors were usually visible at night. Seeing one during the day was rare. But this fireball kept growing larger. Instinctively, Luo Wen believed meteors were harmless. He even remembered the superstition that if one made a sincere wish upon seeing a meteor, it might come true. I wonder if daytime meteors work, Luo Wen muttered as he closed his eyes and made a wish. When he opened them again, something seemed off. The fireball continued to grow, its blazing tail streaking through the atmosphere. Behind it, countless smaller fireballs began to appear. Damn it! Luo Wen cursed as the largest fireball rapidly filled his field of vision. In mere moments, it seemed to encompass everything. Only then did Luo Wen realize the problem. This meteor was far too large. Moreover, its trajectory was heading straight toward him. Even if it missed, it would crash somewhere nearby. Even with his limited knowledge, Luo Wen knew being hit by a meteor wouldn't be a pleasant experience. As the meteor drew closer, Luo Wen could feel the surrounding air heating up. With his current speed, whether flying or running, he wouldn't be able to escape far enough. Calling for his storm god mount would take too long. With no other options, Luo Wen scrambled a few steps forward and dove headfirst into the ocean. At the same time, the swarm network searched for nearby nodes. In an instant, waves erupted around him as several big-headed monster fish surged to his side. They clamped onto his appendages and dragged him toward the depths. The big-headed monster fish moved with incredible speed. Even pulling Luo Wen, they created a visible wake underwater. As the sunlight above dimmed, Luo Wen exhaled in relief. At hundreds of meters below the surface, he should be safe now. Chapter 134, A Natural Disaster, 1. What Luo Wen didn't know was that the massive fireball was a small asteroid over 10 kilometers in diameter. The smaller fireballs trailing behind it were meteors it had captured while wandering through the cosmos. Now, the asteroid and its entourage had arrived at this planet. The asteroid's followers were less concerning. As they passed through the atmosphere, most disintegrated and failed to cause significant damage to the planet. The asteroid, however, was a different story. Traveling at over 70,000 km per hour and blazing with light and heat, it slammed into the surface. Upon impact, the asteroid exploded, most of it vaporized instantly. The energy released was equivalent to the simultaneous detonation of millions of nuclear bombs. The shockwaves radiated outward from the point of impact, sending massive rock fragments hurtling into the sky and triggering catastrophic tsunamis, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. Within minutes, areas thousands of kilometers away were affected. Unfortunately, Luo Wen was not far from the impact site. Despite having fled to a depth of several hundred meters underwater and continuing to dive deeper, his location remained within the core blast zone. The shockwave instantly stripped away hundreds of meters of seawater. Before the water could travel far, it was vaporized. Though Luo Wen's defenses were formidable, they were utterly ineffective against this apocalyptic force. Even the heat-resistant nanomaterials in his mantis shrimp-like appendages extended his survival by only 0.01 seconds before he, too, was vaporized. As the explosion hurled rocks skyward, they began to rain down as fiery meteors across areas over 1,000 kilometers away. Any life forms that had survived the initial blast were now pummeled by this infernal barrage, many crushed to death. The asteroid's effects continued to spread. The dust and debris thrown into the atmosphere began to blanket the planet, blocking sunlight and darkening the skies. The once brilliant Milky Way was now obscured by a suffocating haze. The friction within the dust clouds generated intense heat, igniting wildfires worldwide and incinerating vast swaths of life. Burning rocks continued to rain down, and tsunamis swallowed the land. Yet this was merely the beginning of the disaster. After the explosions subsided, the molten rock from the impact covered an area spanning thousands of kilometers. Surface temperatures, initially exceeding tens of thousands of degrees, gradually dropped to around 300 degrees Celsius but remained unbearably high for months. Life in the surrounding region was utterly unsustainable. Even creatures that escaped the initial devastation could not endure such hostile conditions. Other parts of the world fared little better. The atmospheric dust prevented sunlight from reaching the surface. Plants that had miraculously survived the wildfires could no longer photosynthesize and began to wither. As temperatures plummeted due to the lack of sunlight, frost blanketed the land outside the impact zone. Large herbivorous dinosaurs, particularly those requiring substantial amounts of food, began to perish en masse. Without herbivores to sustain them, carnivorous species soon followed into extinction. Only a handful of life forms, those sheltered deep underground, managed to survive. Luo Wen, who had been vaporized, entered a state of confusion. Remarkably, he had not died. His consciousness had appeared within the swarm network. Luo Wen couldn't feel his body anymore. That was hardly surprising after all, it had been vaporized. Being able to feel it would have been more perplexing. After a brief adjustment, he realized he had become a network being. Except for the lack of a physical form, everything else felt nearly the same as before. Just as he usually accessed the swarm network, Luo Wen could still sense its nodes. Though the number of nodes in his mental space was rapidly dwindling, he could use his consciousness to descend upon surviving swarm entities. Even if his host body died, his consciousness could return to the network. Did this mean that as long as the swarm network existed, he would not perish? Despite the ongoing apocalypse, extinguishing the swarm seemed nearly impossible. Take the fungal carpet, for instance. Its adaptability was unparalleled, thanks to the fusion of countless genes. Unless the entire planet was reduced to dust, the fungal carpet was sure to endure. Moreover, the large fungal clusters on the carpet also possessed node identities. As long as these clusters persisted, the swarm network would remain operational. Did this imply that Luo Wen's consciousness could exist indefinitely? Whether this was true would require time to confirm. Still, discovering this hidden ability was an unexpected boon, though Luo Wen would have preferred not to learn about it in such a way. For a brief moment, Luo Wen had genuinely believed he was dead. Since the swarm had taken control of the continent and life had stabilized, Luo Wen often used consciousness descent to perform tasks in other swarm bodies. Direct action, especially personal hunting, had become exceedingly rare. Now that he had lost his physical body, it seemed not to matter much in practice. Yet the situation felt undeniably strange. His body had contained the innate talents of the Ephi-ish. Luo Wen wasn't sure what his current state represented, but he was certain the Ephi-ish's predecessors had never encountered anything like this. After all, the swarm network was a unique mutation of his. After a brief moment to collect himself, Luo Wen began examining the swarm's current state. All nodes near the impact site had been annihilated. Even the fungal carpet had been obliterated, total devastation. However, the brood nest had been located in the earliest swarm base, far from the impact site. Though its situation was precarious, it had been deeply buried underground and remained unaffected. Luo Wen attempted to connect with the brood nest and found no abnormalities. Everything worked as usual. He could still access the genetic library and use the gene manipulation functions. To his surprise, he discovered another hidden feature. Previously, he had noticed the swarm network's cloud storage capabilities. He could upload his genetic library, allowing the brood nest to receive it remotely without requiring physical contact. The genetic library contained not only the genes he had collected but also his entire genetic blueprint, including the enigmatic Ephi-ish primal genes. When Luo Wen instructed the brood nest to produce a body based on his genetic template, the process proceeded smoothly. The surrounding fungal carpet began supplying nutrients. Due to the complexity of Luo Wen's genes, it took a long time before the brood nest finally extruded an egg measuring 30 centimeters in diameter. Such a large egg pushed the brood nest to its production limits, leaving it noticeably depleted. However, with the powerful support of the fungal carpet, it should recover quickly. Chapter 135, A Natural Disaster, 2. The external environment continued to deteriorate, showing no signs of recovery in the short term. Most of the Air Force bases located atop mountain peaks had suffered devastating blows. Under such atmospheric conditions, the storm gods were unable to sustain high-altitude flight. The pervasive heat and ash wreaked havoc on their respiratory systems, leading to heavy casualties. Left with no choice, Luo Wen ordered them to fly at low altitudes and seek shelter in nearby underground bases. However, their massive bodies were never accounted for when the passageways were originally designed, making access impossible. Luo Wen considered the situation for a moment but ultimately decided not to concern himself further. The foundation and logistics of the swarm had improved significantly since his initial awakening. Even if all the storm gods perished, it wouldn't take long to regenerate their ranks. Near the testing grounds, which were closer to the impact site, falling fire and rock had ignited the forest. Experimental units produced by the swarm were being directed by the blades to evacuate collectively. Now that the storm gods were no longer available as transport, the survival rate of these units was uncertain. As for the wild specimens, some had followed the swarm's experimental units in retreat, but many escaped amidst the chaos. Luo Wen couldn't spare attention for them at the moment. If they ran, so be it. The brood queens, worker ants and worker drones being situated outside the impact core zone survived for the most part. Their long-term activity within underground bases shielded them from the first wave of shockwaves and meteorite showers. Currently, they were digging tunnels to extend the base deeper underground while relocating the brood queens to safety. The modified spider combat bugs and airborne units also began migrating underground. However, with limited subterranean space and no digging capabilities of their own, they could only follow the blades to locate caves for temporary shelter. Days passed, yet the disaster outside showed no signs of abating. The skies remained dark, and both flora and fauna were crying out in anguish. Since the swarm took over the surface, the underground sections of newly established bases were relatively small, mainly designed to house brood queens and nurture larvae. Bases farther from the impact site could manage with new excavations, but those nearby failed to accommodate their populations in time. The fortunate ones found caves to hibernate in, while the less fortunate. With fewer active bugs outside, Luo Wen's control over certain areas of the continent weakened. Yet, considering that most life forms were barely clinging to existence, territorial control became irrelevant. 10 days later, Luo Wen's new body hatched. Transferring his consciousness into it, he took over the new form. This body measured only 30 centimeters in length, significantly smaller than before. Yet, it retained all its abilities. After a brief period of adjustment, Luo Wen found no abnormalities. If he wished to restore his former size, he would only need to replenish energy and molt a few times. But he had no intention of doing so. Too many unexpected events had occurred. Once believing himself the absolute ruler of the planet, the sudden calamity nearly claimed his life. Now, he managed most of the swarm's affairs through the swarm network, transferring his consciousness to the bodies of bugs when necessary. Aside from lacking the Ephiish's innate talents, these bugs were almost indistinguishable from his own body. There was no need for him to handle everything personally. With his main body reduced in size, it became more agile. He could now fit into narrow crevices that were previously inaccessible. Luo Wen decided to separate his main body from the brood nest, hiding them to avoid being wiped out in one fell swoop. Since his main body could reconstruct a brood nest, and the brood nest could produce his body, as long as either survived, he could regenerate, and the swarm would endure. Moreover, Luo Wen planned to delve deeper into this aspect. If the brood queens could also download his genetic database, wouldn't that mean any surviving brood queen could create his body or a new brood nest? Alternatively, he might find a way to produce more brood nests or backup bodies. If any of these breakthroughs succeeded, his survival capability would be exponentially enhanced. With his consciousness existing in the network and his body infinitely reproducible, he would achieve true immortality. The external disaster persisted. While Luo Wen wanted to separate from the brood nest as soon as possible, now wasn't the right time. For the moment, he remained with the brood nest, instructing it and the two brood queens in the base to focus on producing burrower ants and worker ants. These two units consumed less energy, and burrower ants excelled at digging tunnels, while worker ants could assist in digging, care for larvae, and tend to the fungal carpet. They were the most essential bugs in the current situation. The experience of nearly being vaporized had left Luo Wen jittery, especially when confined to the same location as the brood nest. Since relocation was out of the question, he ordered the tunnels to be dug deeper. The fungal carpet, infused with diverse genetic traits, could thrive even without sunlight. Its robust roots penetrated hundreds of meters underground, extracting deeply buried nutrients. Additionally, it could break down rocks and minerals to absorb their nutrients, an extraordinarily resourceful process. With the fungal carpet's support, the number of burrower ants and worker ants in the underground base had reached 10 billion within a short span. The two brood queens played a pivotal role, each capable of producing tens of millions of micro-eggs daily. Meanwhile, the brood nest appeared somewhat drained, possibly due to the strain of producing Luo Wen's new body or its reduced size, shrinking from 60 centimeters to 50. Currently, the brood nest's main task was producing brood queens. Compared to the brood queens, its ability to produce other units was negligible. Under the relentless efforts of the burrower ants, the underground base had reached a depth of 500 meters. Though the environment was stifling and occasionally waterlogged, Luo Wen felt a shred of security. While his consciousness could persist within the swarm network as long as bugs remained, the loss of his main body and brood nest would strip him of his innate talent, preventing him from adding new genes. This would effectively cap his potential. With lofty ambitions of exploring the stars, losing his talent now would confine him to being a mere planetary lord. The vastness of outer space would become unattainable, a devastating blow. Though the means of venturing into space were still unclear, Luo Wen believed time alone would eventually lead him to escape this planet as long as he retained his talent. The asteroid impact had also brought into sharp focus his insignificance. His previous pride in conquering a planet had been shattered. In the grand scale of the universe, even a planet was a trivial entity, and being its lord was a perilous occupation. If the swarm continued to be confined to a single planet, it would be defenseless against cosmic hazards. Conversely, spreading the swarm across the cosmos would make it nearly indestructible. Such an expansion would also guarantee Luo Wen's safety. Chapter 136, The Escaping Test Subjects. After a prolonged period of intense heat, the external environment began to cool significantly, with temperatures soon plummeting below freezing. The combination of darkness and cold caused a mass die-off of vegetation. Large herbivores, such as Triceratops, relied on consuming hundreds of kilograms of plants daily to sustain their massive bodies. Once the plants withered, it wasn't long before these giants began succumbing to hunger one by one. Their corpses became the final feast for carnivorous dinosaurs. After the large herbivores perished, smaller plant eaters followed closely, dying in droves from starvation and cold. Once the carnivorous dinosaurs finished their feast, they too faced extinction due to the lack of food. In contrast, small omnivorous creatures managed to survive. Feeding on leftover carcasses, buried plant roots, and insect larvae, they found ways to endure. From his underground haven, Luo Wen monitored the outside world daily through the eyes of surviving bugs scattered across the globe. His primary focus was on the escaping experimental subjects. The conditions near the impact zone were particularly harsh, given the proximity of the test site to the asteroid's core. The small dinosaurs, despite their sharp teeth, communication abilities, and tool usage, lacked the ability to dig burrows. Some of the smarter individuals tried to use sticks and stones to dig pits, but their claw structures rendered such efforts inefficient. Unable to stay in one place for long, the harsh environment forced them into constant flight. Along the way, they found temporary refuge in caves or the burrows of other animals. After the vegetation died out, they encountered the remains of large herbivorous dinosaurs. These colossal creatures had previously been beyond their reach as prey. The taste of such prey inflated their confidence, as the top predators had long been eradicated by the swarm. The small dinosaurs saw themselves as the apex hunters of the surface. However, their arrogance was short-lived. Soon, the lack of food forced them into a dire predicament, and their narrow dietary habits put them on the brink of annihilation. The situation for the tail-lard rats was similar. Although weaker in combat, these creatures were natural diggers. Instead of seizing other animals' burrows, they survived the initial disaster by digging their own. During their subsequent escape, they consumed whatever was available: meat, plants, and even occasional dinosaur carcasses. Despite the dangers of their journey, they managed relatively well. As meat became scarcer, they relied on their omnivorous nature and the reserves in their tail-lard organs to scrape by. The turning point came when the tail-lard rats encountered the desperate small dinosaurs. The small dinosaurs, blinded by hunger and delirium, attacked the rats without hesitation, ignoring the fact that they had once been fellow experimental subjects in the same facility. During the early days of their escape, the dinosaurs' inability to dig led to significant losses. Now, about 100 small dinosaurs remained. In contrast, the tail-lard rats, with their higher reproduction rates and lesser losses during the escape, still numbered over 300. On the surface, the rats seemed no match for the dinosaurs. Their genetic predisposition to see the dinosaurs as predators should have caused them to flee. However, the small dinosaurs were now nearly exhausted, while the rats retained some strength. Additionally, the rats could wield weapons and, through Luo Wen's experiments and education, had developed a degree of intelligence. They could comprehend their predicament. Instead of retreating, the tail-lard rats rallied under the leadership of a few particularly robust individuals and charged toward the small dinosaurs. The ensuing battle of prey versus predator was unexpectedly intense. The small dinosaurs maintained an advantage in combat strength, with their speed and coordination in small-scale skirmishes. They killed over 10 tail-lard rats during the clash. However, the rats didn't emerge unscathed either. Despite their hasty response and lack of weapons for all members, they managed to gang up on and kill 4 small dinosaurs. The conflict wasn't aimed at annihilating the opposing side. The small dinosaurs sought food. After obtaining several rat carcasses, their leader gave a few shrill cries, and leveraging their superior speed, the dinosaurs swiftly retreated with their spoils. The tail-lard rats, being forced into the fight, naturally didn't pursue them blindly. Thus, this skirmish, lasting over 20 minutes, abruptly came to an end. Although the initial clash was over, the war between the two groups had only just begun. The small dinosaurs, having fed, regained some clarity. Drawing on their experiences, they began trailing the tail-lard rat group by following their tracks. A group of hundreds of tail-lard rats found it impossible to hide their trail. Nor could they outpace the faster dinosaurs. This left them unable to shake their pursuers. With their intelligence restored, the small dinosaurs avoided large-scale conflicts. Instead, they used their speed to launch opportunistic attacks on the rats. After suffering several losses, the tail-lard rats began traveling in tight formations and avoiding solitary movement. They also started crafting weapons during their journey. A few days later, every tail-lard rat had a sharpened spear. Standing upright on their hind legs with spears in hand, they presented an imposing image. Moreover, their unified march deprived the small dinosaurs of opportunities to strike, leaving the predators starving for days. Life wasn't easy for the rats either. Grouping together reduced their ability to scavenge food, leaving them to rely on the reserves in their tail-lard organs. Unable to endure their hunger any longer, the small dinosaurs launched another attack on the main rat group. This time, armed with weapons, the rats held their ground. Both sides incurred heavy losses, with the rats losing 9 members and the dinosaurs losing 8. The dinosaurs left with several rat and dinosaur carcasses as spoils of war. The small dinosaurs, satiated, temporarily ceased their attacks, allowing the rats to gather food and replenish their energy. A few days later, another battle occurred. This time, the rats lost 10 members, while the dinosaurs suffered 7 casualties. In yet another clash days later, the rats lost 9 members, while the dinosaurs lost 11, a first where dinosaur losses exceeded those of the rats. This shift stemmed from the rats' newfound understanding of traps. One rat, for reasons unknown, had begun digging pits around the group's rest areas and covering them with rudimentary camouflage. Chapter 137, Miracles. During one of the small dinosaurs' assaults, an unfortunate individual stepped into a trap. Though the trap was crude and only about 30 centimeters deep, it sent the sprinting dinosaur tumbling forward. Unluckily for it, the fall landed it right in front of the tail-lard rat's formation. Before the dinosaur could recover, 7 or 8 spears pierced its body. When the small dinosaurs attacked again a few days later, the surroundings of the tail-lard rat group were littered with similar improvised traps. This skirmish proved disastrous for the small dinosaurs, resulting in the loss of 13 individuals, while the tail-lard rats lost only 7. After the battle, the small dinosaur population had dropped below 100, leaving them with double-digit numbers. At this rate, complete annihilation seemed inevitable. It was then, as the small dinosaurs licked their wounds, that they stumbled upon a group of over 50 wild counterparts. Relying on their superior numbers and intelligence, they successfully absorbed the wild group, restoring their numbers to over 150. Such coincidences don't happen by chance. These 50-odd wild dinosaurs had been sent by Luo Wen. Although both groups had initially escaped the experimental site and vanished from Luo Wen's surveillance for a while, once Luo Wen had stabilized his situation and resumed control, these escapees were once again within his sight. With little else to do underground, Luo Wen had been closely observing the battles between the two groups. Through this observation, Luo Wen noted that under constant threat and crisis, both types of experimental subjects, particularly the tail-lard rats, were exhibiting explosive growth in intelligence. Luo Wen found this understandable. During the experimental phase, the original version of the tail-lard rats already had larger brains than the small dinosaurs. If brain size increased by 10% with each generation, the tail-lard rats would far surpass the small dinosaurs after an equal number of experimental cycles. Moreover, the tail-lard rats' shorter growth cycles meant they had undergone more experimental rounds. A large brain alone was just the foundation. The life and death crises they faced acted as the catalyst, activating their potential. The rapid development of their intelligence became evident when the tail-lard rats began making traps and applying them effectively. This discovery thrilled Luo Wen. He had gone to great lengths to build the experimental site precisely for such results. To maintain the pressure on the tail-lard rats, Luo Wen ensured the small dinosaurs remained a formidable threat. However, he couldn't go overboard. If the small dinosaurs became too numerous and wiped out the rats, it would undermine his experiment. After calculating the balance, Luo Wen sent over the additional wild dinosaurs. From then on, the small dinosaurs launched periodic assaults on the tail-lard rat group. The experimental subjects noticed that the newly joined wild individuals lacked their honed instincts, recklessly charging during attacks and even sacrificing themselves at critical moments. Within a few battles, these new members were almost entirely wiped out, while the experimental dinosaurs remained intact. Just as this wave of recruits was depleted, another group of wild dinosaurs appeared, easily integrating into the experimental group. Similarly, the tail-lard rats encountered their own miraculous reinforcements. During their escape, they absorbed several wild counterparts who fought fearlessly. With their addition, the experimental rats stopped suffering any losses. Despite this, the tension between the two groups remained high. Neither side knew the meaning of actors, much less those risking their lives for a staged performance. The two groups continued their struggle, traversing over 1,000 kilometers. This endurance alone was a miracle. By now, the environment had shifted from scorching heat to biting cold. The tail-lard rats ceased their flight and settled in a defensible ravine, where they began digging burrows. While excavating, they also set up numerous traps outside the valley. When the pursuing small dinosaurs arrived, their smarter leaders assessed the situation and decided against rashly charging into the trap-laden area. Nor did they retreat. With food becoming increasingly scarce, leaving the area presented too many uncertainties. They chose instead to claim nearby territory, encouraged by a particularly clever wild dinosaur among them. However, settling down wasn't easy for the small dinosaurs, who lacked burrowing skills. It was then they miraculously discovered a cave of suitable size and location. The cave was small at the entrance but widened as it extended underground, revealing a series of larger chambers. Additionally, they found 2 more exits, both small and concealed, making them easy to defend or block. The cave was also well insulated and warm. Each group now had a base of operations. As their lives stabilized, their reproductive instincts surfaced. Soon, some of the tail-lard rats and small dinosaurs became pregnant. With their populations replenished, a prolonged war began. The small dinosaurs continued their intermittent raids on the rats' base, though the terrain limited their success. Whenever they were on the brink of starvation, they would stumble upon some food. The tail-lard rats scoured the underground for plant roots and insect larvae, but their yields dwindled over time. Even the branches and leaves covering their valley traps were consumed, leaving them in dire straits. Then, under the guidance of a wild counterpart, they learned to farm. Through trial and error, they identified a shade-tolerant crop. With this crop, they managed to scrape by. As the weather grew colder, the newborn generations of tail-lard rats and small dinosaurs became increasingly intelligent. Yet, they could only imagine the sun based on descriptions passed down from their elders. The two experimental groups' emerging societal structures created a need for more efficient communication. Some brighter individuals began developing languages based on the writing Luowen had initially taught them. Naturally, the tail-lard rats progressed faster than the small dinosaurs. After mastering farming, the rats achieved a degree of self-sufficiency. The small dinosaurs, however, would have faced extinction without Luowen's miraculous interventions. Luowen had already made his decision internally. For now, the small dinosaurs still had value. The tail-lard rats needed sustained pressure to accelerate their evolution and development, so the small dinosaurs would continue to receive miraculous assistance. Chapter 138, The Evolution of Civilization, 1. The dust from the initial impact and the volcanic ash from subsequent eruptions lingered in the atmosphere for decades before gradually settling back to the ground. As the air cleared and the dust thinned, the earth once again basked in sunlight. Temperatures began to rise, and the frost on the ground melted. After a few heavy rains, life started to flourish again, and the airborne particles rapidly diminished. Early in the morning, a few juvenile tail-lard rats crawled out of their burrows. Although the PM 2.5 levels in the air remained high, they were no longer a barrier to outdoor activity. T/N, PM 2.5 refers to fine particulate matter that is 2.5 micrometers or smaller in diameter. These tiny particles can remain suspended in the air and are harmful to health when inhaled. These younglings were fortunate. The ancestors of their ancestors had only imagined what the sun looked like, and now, they could see it for themselves. The tail-lard rats reproduced rapidly but lived short lives, rarely surviving beyond a decade. Over these decades, countless rats perished from natural causes, not to mention those lost to wars and accidents. Their greatest enemy at the time had disappeared in the historical tide after battling them for over 2 decades during the calamity. With no predators left, the population of the tail-lard rats exploded. They expanded their underground burrows and farms repeatedly, yet it was never enough to contain their growth. Then, Internal wars broke out. In just a few decades, over a dozen civil wars erupted among the tail-lard rats, each costing countless lives. After every war, resources became abundant again, leading to a period of peace. However, this cycle of population explosion and civil conflict continued. Until they discovered the light. The surviving tail-lard rats could not comprehend the meaning of light. Just as they couldn't understand the concept of the sun or the divine beings their ancestors had spoken of. These tales, along with their language and script, were passed down from their forebears. Legends told of their race and their ancient adversaries being primitive beasts before a god took pity on them, granting them intelligence and teaching them knowledge. However, their ancestors were too foolish, angering this god, who then punished them. A colossal fireball descended from the heavens, obliterating their homeland. Much of what happened afterward is unrecorded, as few written accounts survived that time. Many were lost during civil wars. What remains now is largely oral tradition. The legends describe the god as compassionate and merciful. In his later years, the sage who introduced agriculture revealed the truth: agriculture was not his invention but a gift from the god, who had not forsaken them. Perhaps their infighting had once again angered the god, leading to his disappearance. Today, the younger generations only hear these tales as stories, dismissing the existence of the god. The tail-lard rats emerging from their burrows faced a vast expanse of land, unrestrained by population limits. At this time, there were over 100,000 tail-lard rats underground. After some deliberation, they divided into dozens of groups and set off in different directions. The tail-lard rats had entered the tribal age. Luo Wen carefully nurtured this seed of civilization. He realized that excessive interference might hinder their development. Thus, beyond some necessary guidance and assistance, he refrained from intervening in their affairs, including their civil wars. After several generations, the tail-lard rats had become more intelligent than their ancestors. They had grown accustomed to using tools and adapted to walking upright. In them, Luo Wen saw echoes of Earth's early hominids. The post-catastrophe planet was in ruins, but with no natural predators, the tail-lard rats rapidly spread across the continent. Their expansion was astonishingly swift. The previous experimental area was now too small to contain this burgeoning civilization. Luo Wen decided to broaden the scope of his experiment, designating the entire continent as their new field of development. To avoid disrupting the tail-lard rats' growth, Luo Wen removed all large insect beasts and fungal carpets from the continent, leaving only small ants and flying insects to serve as observational aids. As for Luo Wen himself, he wasn't idle. He headed to the ocean to further develop the swarm. At the very least, he aimed to maintain the strength needed to control the situation should the experiment spiral out of control. The planet's oceans were several times larger than its landmass, and despite the calamity, the seas still teemed with genetic samples. Over the years, Luo Wen had not been idle, aside from observing his experimental subjects. He had gained new insights into his abilities and genetic composition. However, escaping this planet remained a distant goal. Luo Wen was not one to pin his hopes on a single method. Within his capabilities, he explored multiple paths: self-evolution, discovering unique genes, and nurturing civilizations were just a few. Heading to the sea to collect samples was only part of the plan. His second goal was to separate himself from the brood nest. Luo Wen had long been uneasy about being near the brood nest. For the sake of the swarm's future, he decided to leave the brood nest in an underground base that had been excavated to a depth of 2,000 meters over many years. This task had not been easy for the swarm. Beyond a certain depth, each additional meter of excavation required extensive reinforcement work, which was exceedingly tedious. Luo Wen's main body, meanwhile, would move toward the ocean depths. He recalled his earlier knowledge that the challenges of developing the deep sea were on par with venturing into space. Resisting the intense pressure of the deep sea was no simpler than surviving in space. Since space exploration was temporarily out of reach, he would first conquer the deep sea. The immense pressure of the ocean depths, Luo Wen believed, would serve as a catalyst to push his innate abilities to their limits, enhancing his strength. The rapid reproduction of the tail-lard rats also accelerated the progress of their civilization. With no natural predators, their population surged from 100,000 to over 1 billion. This population boom strained resources and led to the emergence of social classes. Some clever tail-lard rats began employing others for labor. Subsequently, trade practices emerged, leading to the birth of commerce. At this point, the legendary god reappeared. Several tribal chieftains and wise men claimed to have received the god's favor, stating that the god had taught them numbers for calculation and trade. They also claimed the god resided on the moon, and if they could reach it, they might meet him. When asked what the god looked like, their descriptions varied widely. Some said it was a beautiful bird, others a kind of flying insect, and still others a giant ant. The tail-lard rats doubted their claims, believing the god to be a fabrication. Yet the knowledge of numbers spread, facilitating trade. Meanwhile, the desire to reach the moon quietly took root in their hearts. Chapter 139, The Evolution of Civilization, 2. According to incomplete statistics, inventors among the tail-lard rats suddenly multiplied. Publicly or secretly, they employed various methods in an attempt to fly. Although they vocally denied believing in the existence of a god, their actions betrayed their curiosity. Unfortunately, the tail-lard rats' tools were still primitive. Those who built large slingshots to launch themselves into the air were considered advanced thinkers. Most rats simply climbed the tallest trees in their vicinity and leapt off in acts of faith. This led to a significant number of casualties. Luo Wen, who was always observing, couldn't help but laugh and cry at their antics. Fortunately, with the tail-lard rats' large population, these losses were manageable. Surprisingly, this wave of experimental failures ignited a certain passion among the rats. A flurry of inventions and creations emerged, reminiscent of bamboo shoots sprouting after rain. While most ideas were laughable, a few proved practical. One such breakthrough was the wheel. Its invention quickly gave rise to carts, significantly improving transportation efficiency among the tail-lard rats. Besides the tail-lard rats, other animals had also survived the catastrophe. Among them was a creature that resembled a cross between a dinosaur and a bird. Its forelimbs had evolved into small, plump wings, rendering it flightless, while its strong hind legs made it an excellent runner. Some tail-lard rats discovered and domesticated these creatures to pull carts. Inspired by this, many other animals suffered similar fates. After much trial and error, the rats identified species suitable for domestication and breeding, using them as food sources or labor. With their productivity greatly enhanced, the tail-lard rats experienced another population explosion. However, as per capita resources dwindled, wars erupted once again. It is often said that war is a catalyst for technological progress. This might be nonsense when both sides possess city-destroying nuclear weapons, but in primitive societies, there is some truth to it. During wartime, rulers invested heavily in manpower and resources to develop weapons. Numerous military inventions emerged, including war chariots and crossbows. In the later stages of war, even metal tools made their debut. At this stage of civilization, Luo Wen found himself out of depth. He had been an ordinary person in his previous life, and most of the knowledge he had learned over the years had long been forgotten. Furthermore, as an alien world, it was uncertain how applicable Earth's knowledge would be here. Although he could no longer assist the tail-lard rats in advancing scientific knowledge, he could still guide them in other areas. As a result, the rulers of the tail-lard rats gradually learned about concepts such as family planning and eugenics, and came to understand their significance. Over the next decade, the tail-lard rats fought several more wars. Afterward, the thousands of tribes were consolidated into 5 major powers. By this time, Luo Wen had reached the seabed at a depth of 8,000 meters. The atmospheric pressure here was astonishing, with nearly a ton of weight pressing down on an area the size of a fingernail. Luo Wen had drawn inspiration from various sea creatures to reach this point. First, after several molts, he replaced his exoskeleton with a soft cartilage structure. This spongier material was more resistant to pressure than hard bone, though its defense capabilities were poor. Luo Wen was experimenting with combining the strengths of both to create a new type of armor. Furthermore, the immense pressure here could collapse even the protein structures at the cellular level. To combat this, his body produced a high concentration of oxidized compounds that stabilized his physical structure. In addition to these adaptations, Luo Wen acquired many other fascinating skills. For example, in the lightless deep sea, many organisms produced their own light. Their unique understanding of bioelectricity proved invaluable. Luo Wen quietly absorbed these discoveries. Deep-sea resources were scarce, so he prioritized modifying the fungal carpet. Its inherent adaptability made it ideal for integration with deep-sea genes, allowing it to take root and provide Luo Wen with a steady energy supply. Meanwhile, the tail-lard rat's civilization evolved rapidly. Some rulers recognized the power of technology and, guided from the shadows, began to promote education and nurture talent. However, due to their short lifespans, tail-lard rats' leaders changed frequently. Some resisted progress, but they invariably met with strange accidents. The same lifespan issue plagued the rats' intellectuals. Advanced scientific knowledge required time to learn and accumulate, and the tail-lard rats' mere decade-long lives made such accumulation impossible. Consequently, their technological progress stagnated after reaching a certain level. Luo Wen, observing this issue, quickly deployed a batch of swarm-modified tail-lard rats carrying longevity genes. Thanks to their incredible reproductive efficiency, the genes spread rapidly. The rats' maximum lifespan increased steadily, enabling technological progress to resume. However, the longer-lived rats faced severe population pressure, and soon resource conflicts led to war once more. The 5 major powers were eventually reduced to 2, the Kingdom of Kerrigan and the Kingdom of Merican. The Kerrigan royal family consisted of a mutant strain of white-furred tail-lard rats. Their pure white fur made them rare and striking, granting them a natural charisma among the predominantly mottled rats. Luo Wen had discovered their ancestors long ago and given them the surname Kerrigan as a tribute. The white-furred rats, believing themselves to be divinely chosen, eagerly established their power base. Their rise to prominence was not without Luo Wen's covert assistance. In contrast, the Kingdom of Merican reached its current status entirely through its own efforts. Its royal family, with solid grey fur, produced several visionary and capable leaders, building their strength over time and achieving their present-day stability. The 2 kingdoms, one in the north and the other in the south, divided the continent between them. Equally matched, they eventually chose to cease hostilities. With 5 powers reduced to 2, resources were consolidated, spurring another wave of technological advancement. Yet, the population problem persisted. Shortly after the war, both kingdoms experienced another population surge, leading to resource scarcity once again. Luo Wen, observing from the shadows, tirelessly managed the situation. Another batch of genetically modified tail-lard rats was discreetly introduced. These rats were engineered with limited fertility, producing a maximum of 1 to 3 offspring annually and extended lifespans, raising the maximum age to 60 years, 4 to 5 times the original. 30 years passed quickly. The 2 kingdoms fought 2 more wars due to various disputes. Most of the old population without the new genes had died off, and those remaining were too old to reproduce. The birth rate gradually declined, and after years of adjustment, the population finally stabilized at an optimal level. Chapter 140, Dialogue. The 2 great kingdoms, whose populations had sharply declined, no longer needed to resort to war to reduce their numbers. However, the conflicts between them, forged over years of relentless warfare, had become irreconcilable. Although no open battles occurred, a Cold War emerged as both sides sought to outdo each other in other fields. Influenced by certain unknown factors, both kingdoms began to prioritize education, establish schools, and nurture talent. In this environment, the technological advancement of the rat people progressed at a staggering pace. New and innovative theories were proposed almost daily, leading to the invention of the steam engine, trains, and airplanes. Perhaps the enduring legends of the gods continued to influence the rat people in subtle ways, as they maintained an extraordinary fascination with the 2 moons in their sky. One day, a rat person proposed the idea of a moon landing program, and the situation spiraled out of control. The term seemed to ignite a fire within the populace, unleashing unprecedented enthusiasm. Public demand for the moon landing grew louder by the day. The royal families of both kingdoms, especially the Kingdom of Kerrigan, did not go against the tide of public opinion. Legends passed down by the Kerrigan ancestors made them even more determined to unravel the mysteries of the moons. Thus, with the rulers going along with the tide, related research institutions were quickly established, and resources were directed toward these efforts. A vast number of students began studying fields related to the program. The moon landing quietly became the new focal point of competition between the 2 kingdoms. In the vast plains, patches of farmland stretched as far as the eye could see. At the center of the plain stood a grand city. Its towering walls bore the marks of time, evidence of its ancient history. This city was the royal capital of the Kerrigan family. It had been their stronghold since their tribal era and had undergone continuous expansion by successive generations to achieve its current grandeur. Named the City of Glory, it spanned 4,500 mu, approximately 750 acres. Including its surrounding satellite towns and villages, the area housed a population of over 1 million rat people. Within the city stood an ancient fortress. Outside the fortress, elite soldiers clad in opulent, well-fitted uniforms stood guard day and night. Armed with a variety of weapons, they patrolled diligently, maintaining a formidable defense. This was the Kerrigan royal palace. 3 years earlier, the previous king of Kerrigan had passed away, and the throne was inherited by the eldest princess of that time. The Kerrigan family's rise to prominence was attributed to their unique white fur, a trait that had earned them a bestowed name from the gods. As a result, they placed great importance on their bloodline. The position of power was always passed down to the purest-blooded members of the family, in the hopes of continuing to receive the gods' favor. Curiously, though the Kerrigans had not encountered these so-called gods in generations and many members of the family even doubted the authenticity of the ancestral stories, their method of succession persisted. Throughout the years, whenever the family faced calamity, they always inexplicably found a way out, narrowly escaping disaster. Thus, whether one believed in the legends or not, the system endured. Over time, intermarriage diluted the Kerrigan bloodline, and pure white-furred family members became increasingly rare. In the current generation, only the eldest princess bore the unblemished white fur. As such, there was little need for a struggle for succession. The eldest princess received unanimous support and ascended the throne without opposition. In a large room of the royal palace, tall, dark wooden bookshelves lined the walls. 2 ladders leaned against the shelves, which were packed with books of varying materials, many of which appeared to be original manuscripts. In one corner of the room, an incense burner emitted a subtle fragrance that calmed the mind. Against another wall stood the skeleton of a colossal creature. At the center of the room was an ancient long table, upon which lay a massive stone tablet etched with intricate patterns. An elderly male rat person, wearing a monocle, held a magnifying glass as he carefully examined the tablet. Suddenly, the room's large doors swung open, and a female rat person stepped inside. She was dressed in a luxurious robe of red and gold. Though young, she carried an air of authority. Her pure white fur and striking red eyes gave her an elegant and refined appearance. "Teacher Morgan, have you uncovered another treasure?" the female rat asked as she glanced around the room. Noticing only the old scholar was present, her stern demeanor softened. She bounded forward and cheerfully addressed him. "Your Majesty, you should mind your decorum," the elder rat said, adjusting his monocle and giving a slight bow. "Teacher, haven't I told you to just call me by my name when Tella isn't around? Ever since I took the throne, you and I have grown distant," the female rat replied. She pulled out a chair and sat down without a care for her image. Morgan shook his head helplessly, indulgently replying, "Fine, fine. Sarah, where have you sent Tella this time?" "She's at the door. I told her I needed to discuss some private matters with you and didn't let her in." The Queen's full name was Sarah Kerrigan, formerly the eldest princess and now the reigning monarch. The Kerrigan family's naming tradition was unique. After their ancestors received their divine name, all descendants took on the name Kerrigan. However, as the rat people's prolific birth rate quickly led to hundreds of Kerrigans, it became impossible to distinguish between individuals. One Kerrigan solved this problem by adopting a personal name, and others soon followed suit. Over time, Kerrigan transitioned from a given name to a surname. While many others adopted this practice, most rat people still preferred simpler names. Morgan raised an eyebrow in resignation, resuming his study of the stone tablet. Tella, the Queen's captain of the guard, was an extremely rigid female rat. Sarah likely had no pressing business here and had simply come to relax. Such visits had occurred numerous times before. "Teacher, you still haven't answered my question." Seeing Morgan ignore her, Sarah got up and moved closer to the stone tablet, her curiosity piqued. Morgan furrowed his brow in thought before recalling her earlier question. Without looking away from the tablet, he said, "This is a relic from the Great Cataclysm, a stone tablet that survived from that time. Back then, the world was shrouded in darkness, and people consumed whatever they could find. Our ancestors used these tablets to record events, even though written language was not yet fully developed. Very few such relics remain, making this one a treasure. The royal treasury has plenty of these things. Didn't you examine them all before? I've never seen you make any breakthroughs," Sarah teased. The kingdom of Kerrigan, ruling half the continent, had no shortage of treasures, but such artifacts didn't interest her. Morgan was briefly taken aback but quickly recovered. As a renowned scholar, he wasn't used to being spoken to so bluntly, yet he couldn't afford to get upset with the white-furred queen. Huffing slightly, he twitched his whiskers and begrudgingly explained, "This one is different. It's older than any other tablet I've studied.